Visiting a city for the first time and not sure what to do? A walking tour is a great place to start. Top Dog Tours is in Boston, Toronto, Philadelphia, and New York City. To book a walking tour, you can visit us at topdogtours.com and be sure to check out our social media accounts for offers and discounts. Hi, I'm Nicole Kelly, and this is She Brew in the City. And today I am talking with Elizabeth Kamens, who is the president of a really amazing organization called 3GNY that I actually found out about because of one of my other guests. And I'm really excited to talk about what the organization does and Elizabeth's family story as well. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good.
Nice to see you again.
I know. It's nice to see you again. I'm good. So I usually like to start off by asking my guests a little bit about kind of their background in general, where they're from, you know, what, if any, Jewish upbringing they had. Did they have a bar or bat mitzvah? That sort of thing.
Sure. So I grew up in Yardley, Pennsylvania, which is like very northern suburbs of Philadelphia in Bucks County.
Okay.
And I grew up in an observant Reform household. So I think a lot of people think, oh, well, if you're Reform, how can you really be observant? But we belong to a temple. My parents still belong to that temple. We observed all of the holidays, all of the traditions, went to synagogue frequently, had a bat mitzvah. Then after my bat mitzvah in the Reform movement, you have confirmation. So I went on and became confirmed. And then I even was an assistant Hebrew school teacher for a few years, so remained very involved in the community in the synagogue, and definitely Judaism was an important part of my upbringing.
Because I've never actually had a guest who was confirmed, and I grew up conservative, so that's not something that we did. And I know what my synagogue does. One of the things they do that's really cool is they do a trip to Berlin, because that's where the Reform movement was founded. So that's part of their confirmation process. What was that like for you?
Wow, that's amazing.
I know, it's pretty fancy. And they take them to, you know, the Book Burning Memorial and the train platform in Berlin, which is like, we're going to do an episode eventually about this trip my husband and I took to Poland and Germany, but I like lost it on that train platform. Like I was fine. And then we got there and I just couldn't handle my life.
Yes, I know exactly where you're talking about, where you're referring to, because I was there on a trip as well. Yeah. But it's very powerful. I mean, all of the places that they bring you that signify everything from the past. It's extremely powerful. Yes. But I wish we had gone to Berlin when I was getting confirmed. That is for sure. But it was honestly, it was a lot of just expanded education. Like the rabbi of the temple taught our 10th grade confirmation, and he was actually really into mystical Judaism and the Kabbalah. So we kind of went into that a lot. And then in 8th and 9th grade, you know, I think there's honestly a lot of missed opportunity, I think, because you have these students that are there, and whether you're, you know, engaging them in current events or whatnot, that we did not do. So it was, you know, something that kind of like we carried through in terms of my Hebrew education. But, you know, I remember really the 10th grade with the rabbi to be the most, I guess, just different than what the prior, you know, years of my Hebrew school education had been, which was mostly prayers and holidays and Israel and that kind of thing.
My favorite question to ask people is, what was their theme of their bat mitzvah?
So I actually didn't have a theme. It was just a really nice, elegant affair that my parents threw, but there wasn't a specific theme. It wasn't like movies or trips or cities or anything like that. It was just the event, which I think was very meaningful. I mean, I think, you know, people can kind of, it's insane how people get so elaborate with their
I've seen
themes.
Like disgustingly elaborate things on Instagram, because I follow a couple Jewish event planners who are dealing with people who are in an extremely different tax bracket than I am. So, and I'll show my husband, he's like, this is disgusting because this is a party for a child. And like, I do love the idea of like very simplistic, because it's not about the party, but I guess sometimes when you're 13, it is about the party, but it's not really about the party.
No, that's exactly right. And I think maybe my opinion's a little controversial, but I don't necessarily, and I also didn't have one, but subscribe to the theme idea. I think it does kind of take away from what you're actually doing and the meaning behind the momentous occasion that is the bar or bat mitzvah. And, when you look back to, sometimes you say, oh, wow, that's what I was interested in that time. But the lack of a theme, I think, is more timeless.
Yeah. One of the rabbis at our synagogue, she didn't have a theme either. She is a twin. And I guess one of the moms in like her Hebrew school class made cake. So they did like a big cake, like a flower basket. And there was like a basketball for her brother. And I don't remember what she said was for her, but it was like a little thing on the cake was kind of their thing. Oh, a Tiffany box. I'm glad that you remembered that. And it's funny because one of the dads in my daughter's class was best friends with her brother growing up. And he's like, I don't remember if there was a theme at their B'nai Mitzvah. So,
wow.
I don't know. I'm just obsessed with the idea of like the crazy, ridiculous parties and the history behind that, because at some point it started, and I want to, as like a budding historian, want to figure out when that started and write a book about it, because I think it's so fascinating and it's such a North American thing.
Yes, that's a very good point. And it is true that it didn't start with that. Back in the day, it was a service and that was it. So then somehow it evolved into this whole other thing that it's become now.
Yeah, like people who had more money would have like a nicer party at a restaurant maybe, but a lot of people would do something in their backyard or at their house, and they wouldn't, but there are people who have like 500 people at bar mitzvahs now. It's like a wedding.
Yes, it is. So then it's, what do you build up to?
Well, that was my mother's argument, is because I wanted a nighttime party really badly, but she was like, I'd rather spend more money and save for your wedding, because no one sits around and talks about your bar bat mitzvahs. And I was like, that's all I do now, is talk to people about their bat mitzvahs. So your reasoning is a little off on that. And I posted something on like a video about being at like the 25th anniversary year of my bat mitzvah, and people commented on it, remembering how much fun they had. So I was like, see, people do remember bar and bat mitzvahs.
Nice.
Yeah, I was actually really surprised. I want to put that on like a business card. Whatever I end up doing, people still talk about my bat mitzvah.
That's so nice.
It's a fun thing. So going back to kind of why we're talking in general, can you tell me about the organization that you are the president of and how the organization got started?
Sure. So I'm the president of an organization called 3GNY, which is an education nonprofit. And it was founded back in 2005 by 6 grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And the education there's a few different elements to it, but essentially, back when it was founded, the grandchildren were looking for like-minded individuals who were looking to share and preserve their grandparents' stories, being that as the third generation, they were able to hear, for the most part, their grandparents' stories directly. And they were the last essentially living link of the individuals who could hear those stories. And when their grandparents had passed away, or, some were still alive, but they realized that when they passed away, they would likely be the last link that had heard those stories, actually that testimony directly from the survivor. So the organization was started, back in 2005 with kind of a general open community mindset, but it's evolved a lot over the years. And one of our main pieces now is what we call the We Do program, or We Educate, where we have a training program and we enable grandchildren of survivors to kind of construct and mold their grandparents' stories in such a way that we then have connections with schools, and we can send these grandchildren, the third generation, into schools to help to share and really preserve the legacy in conjunction with whether it's Holocaust education or World War II, or even diversity, bullying, all of those types of things. And then also 3GNY, the other really large component is the community and the social element, and just gathering together and knowing that, this shared history is amongst everyone that's a part of it.
What age of, let me phrase this in an intelligent way. What are the ages of the school children that you are going and talking to?
So the youngest is about 4th, 5th grade, which some people think could be a little bit young, but it really depends on what you're sharing with them. And then we go all the way up to seniors in high school. So, 18 years old. And we've definitely gone into colleges as well. But I would say the main range is like older end of elementary school, middle school, and high school.
Are these public schools? Are they private schools? How do you get in touch with the school? Like, what is that process? I know I didn't write this down as a question, but, how does that work? Do you have like an ongoing relationship with some schools, or they reach out to you?
It's really both, and that's one of the most important things. So if anyone is listening that has a connection to a school or is an educator, we are constantly seeking classrooms to go into, whether it's private schools, whether it's, public schools, parochial schools, really anything. We can fit into any type of curriculum. And even if it's not, Holocaust-related curriculum, English, or, again, some kinds of diversity education, a lot of different things that we can go into. But we are constantly trying to solicit new schools, new teachers, and then a lot of teachers have had our speakers come for years, and we're just, every year we'll reach out, or they'll reach out to us and say, my lesson is coming up on, World War II, or the students will be reading Night in May. Can a speaker come after we finish this lesson plan? And we hope that by our speakers going into schools, we develop a relationship with a lot of the teachers who usually are there for a very long time in terms of their careers and longevities in these schools, and that we can really develop a relationship with them.
I think that's one of the things that's really important about Holocaust education is it's not just about the Holocaust. It does talk, things like racism and diversity and bullying. It kind of plays into that. And I think, there's that scary statistic that, how many, I'm sure you know the statistic, I can't think today, the percentage of school children who don't know about the Holocaust and that 6 million Jews died. It's a staggeringly high 1/3. So that, yes, thank you. So that 1/3 of school-age children don't know that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. And I think what's so important about your organization is talking about being the last generation. As we get further and further away, we're almost 100 years to the point where the Nazi Party took over. That'll be in 2033. And that's really scary to think that the more we distance ourselves from this, the less and less I think people will know about this. And then we get into that weird area of Holocaust denial, making excuses. And it's a little crazy to me.
No, it's true. And, a lot of states, not enough, but some in New Jersey and New York do have mandated Holocaust education. So that is something that is, we can tie in with that, obviously, in their mandated curriculum, which is important.
Yes. In another life, I want to be a lobbyist who tries to get every state in America and Canada, who especially needs it right now because they're a mess up there with anti-Semitism at the moment. I keep seeing stuff on Instagram, and we are also, like, our company's also in Toronto. And I'm like, I love Canada. I think Canadians are very welcoming. Clearly, they're anti-Semitic for some reason as well.
I know.
So at some point, I think maybe not me, but someone should kind of start lobbying for that, because I think it's super important. It shouldn't just be like a page in a European history book.
Correct. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I know I didn't grow up with it. We didn't have education or mandated at all whatsoever in my school curriculum, which was a problem. It definitely was needed.
I do know anything that I learned, it was through Hebrew school. My 3rd grade Hebrew school teacher was an Auschwitz survivor. She was there when she was 13, told this horribly disturbing story, which may not have been appropriate for 8-year-olds, about how she dug the grave for her parents. So I will never forget that. But, and then I remember when I was in elementary school, it was the first time Schindler's List was shown on television, and it was like a big thing whether or not people were allowed to watch it. I wasn't that I wasn't allowed to watch it, but I didn't watch it, and I'm kind of glad, because I think watching it for the first time as an adult was much more powerful. But I did read the Diary of Anne Frank, I think, when I was like 12.
That's a good age.
Yeah. And we did at my school, we did read Night, and we talked about that. But I feel like when I got to junior high and high school, there wasn't really any curriculum directly about the Holocaust. My husband is saying that they didn't really talk about it other than this is something that happened. And, we did obviously, because we're from California, they talked a lot about the Japanese internment camps. I think we talked more about that than the Holocaust, which California curriculum tends to focus a lot on California. Like in 4th grade, the entire state, it's only California history.
Wow.
So I think that might be part of it. But I mean, who knows? Maybe at my high school and junior high it's changed. But it was, we read night. But I also went to a private school. So I think that was part of the reason we read night. I don't know if it's something I would have happened in 5th grade if I'd gone to a public school. But
sure.
My daughter goes to a Jewish day school, and I know that I remember reading an email that the principal actually comes and reads the book with them night.
Wow.
So, it's kind of like a thing he really cherishes doing with the kids. So I'm sure, also because of me and what I'm trying to go to school for, my daughter will be well aware of all these things, but it's kind of crazy a little bit looking back on the lack of education about like what I consider to be probably the worst thing that ever happened in the history of the world.
Yes. No, I agree. I mean, I went to a public school and I had a Holocaust denier in in one of my classes as a senior. And, there was no curriculum at all. So I don't even remember. Obviously, I knew about it and was almost self-educated in certain ways, but there was nothing, and it would have been very, very necessary and needed. Now looking back, like how easy would it have been to have something to provide to maybe stop that? But who knows?
I've never understood Holocaust deniers because the Nazis were nothing if like very specific about keeping records of everything. And there's a lot of footage of stuff. So I just don't understand the idea of just denying something that's very well documented.
Oh, I agree. I agree.
It's I don't know. When we went to Auschwitz, we asked our tour guide if she'd ever had one. And she said she had a lady whose son was kind of like, I don't know. What did she say? That he was like, not sure, I guess, which is a weird thing to say. Wow. I'm not sure if this happened. But no one who was outright a Holocaust denier, which is good, I guess, as if you're taking people there.
Wow.
So going back to 3GNY, so let's say someone listening or someone who's following me on social media is a 3rd generation of a Holocaust survivor. So how would they get involved with the organization?
Sure. So we absolutely welcome anyone who would like to be involved. I would say the easiest thing is you can email us at info@3gnewyork.org, or you can, reach out to me, to any of the individuals that are involved. We have an Instagram page, 3GNY. Additionally, we have a lot of events that you're free to come to at any time. So our next event will be a virtual event. So the next in-person event will be for Yom HaShoah, which is, I believe, Monday, May 6th. And that is at the Stanton Street Shul. So feel free to come. It's totally open, and we welcome anyone, from the public. We just ask that you would register in advance. But if you really, want to join our speaker training program or just become involved in any capacity, feel free to email us. And we do try, if people are really interested in getting involved, to have a call with them and just explain the organization and see what their background is, what they might want to be interested in, whether it's helping us plan events, whether it's fundraising, school reach, outreach. So any of those things, we welcome anyone to become involved.
So a big part of what you do is sending the 3GNYers, I guess we're going to call them, into schools to educate people. So what type of training do you provide people? So let's say, no one has people don't have a history of public speaking. Maybe they're a little bit nervous. So what is the type of training that you provide them to be able to educate people?
So it's really grounded in constructing your grandparents' story. And then with that, we understand that not everyone loves to public speak or to speak publicly, or is, really wanting to get out there and share. But we don't focus as much on that. But because the story is so personal, I think a lot of people are able to overcome that, to be honest. And we have our training is all virtual. So it's 4 weeks long, and each week focuses on a certain part of kind of constructing this story, or taking what you have, the knowledge that you have, or information, or the history from your grandparent, and kind of culling it together to have a 30 or so minute presentation to bring into a school. So, the first week is kind of an overview. The second week, we ask students to come back with an outline of their grandparents' history, their story. And then the next week, the third week, we ask students to come with like a really specific story from their grandparents' larger story. So some, whether it's some type of incident or, something that happened that they can, the speaker, the grandchild can really put a lot of detail into. And then by the last week, they'll come with kind of a rough presentation, and they'll share it with a smaller group, breakout rooms on Zoom. So by the time the fourth week comes, they've kind of drilled down the facts. And, a lot of grandchildren, when they come to the class, they might have overwhelming amounts of information from their grandparents, or they might have none. So it's really a variety of things. And a lot of times they use the 4-week program to then go back, or, okay, I'm going to be going to my parents or my relative's house in the next month. So let me see if I can ask some questions or get more information while I'm going through this class to see if I can pull out more details for the story. And then we also always offer, if speakers want additional sessions to kind of finesse their story, or if it's been a year since they've gone into a classroom, for example, and they're like, I'm a little rusty, I want to brush up and I want to have someone listen to the story and make sure it flows or it makes sense, we always offer that as well. So the speaker can reach out to us, and we'll always, provide someone who's, a little bit more senior, I guess, within the organization, or has been really speaking a lot, and have them listen in. And then throughout each quarter or so, we do have additional programs where we'll have people from the outside come in and offer sessions with us. So whether that's Rachel Serrati is an example, and she wrote a memoir about her grandmother's story, and she came to us a few years ago now and did a kind of storytelling presentation and how memory works. And we've had another program with more recently, actually, since October 7th, where we had people from the AJC come in, and they spoke with us about dealing with questions relating to Israel or anti-Semitism, because that isn't something that we really go over in the training, but obviously is important and prevalent now.
That makes sense. Is part of the presentation visual? Do they present pictures or video or things like that along with talking?
Yes, absolutely. And again, it's really dependent upon what the family has. So a lot of survivors were able to give testimony to USC Shoah, and they might have recordings. But we do tell, the grandchildren that we want it to be in their voice, even though it's their grandparents' story. So maybe they could include a clip of their grandparents, but we don't, otherwise they could show the whole story from their grandparents. So we really want it to take that and create their own presentation. And a lot of survivors survived with nothing. They have no photographs. They have nothing from their lives before the war. So it really is so varied in terms of what people have when they go to make their presentation. So if people want to use maps or other different types of resources, just to make it interactive for the students. But I would say the majority, almost all really, go into it with some kind of visual presentation, PowerPoint. So at least the students are able to put visuals with the story.
How many speakers do you have that go out to the schools?
We have in the hundreds. I mean, we've trained over 500 speakers to date, and each year it's growing more and more. So each class, we have about 12 to 14 volunteer speakers, and then we run at this point, about 4 or so classes a year. So we have, hundreds of speakers. And granted, not everyone wants to be speaking at the same time. But I believe last year, I think we went into over 60 classrooms. So it's great. And, obviously the more, the better.
So what, in your opinion, makes 3GNY speakers different than people who are Holocaust educators who are not descendants of survivors?
So 3GNY speakers are not claiming to be experts in the Holocaust, but rather experts in our grandparents' story. So I think that's a huge difference in terms of scholars in the Holocaust. And we do tell teachers, we do not teach the Holocaust, but we did hear our grandparents' stories firsthand. So it's able to connect a real face with the story. And we're hoping that providing that close connection to students, it's more real and it's more present than just reading a story in a textbook. But, by any means, we in our training program and in how we aid speakers to go into classrooms, we do not, claim to be experts in the Holocaust. But we do say, a lot of times students will ask questions. So it's good for the speakers to, if they're aware of basic events, particularly if they're mentioning things within their story. So, for example, in my grandparents' stories, I talk about when the Nuremberg laws came into effect. So I might, briefly explain that, but that I don't know. Some students might not have any education on that, within their curriculum. So I might be explaining that to them for the first time. So you want to be able to know what you're talking about, obviously, but at the same time, we're not claiming to be experts.
Gotcha. So I saw that you recently had your first 4G speaker, which is crazy. That, someone knew their great-grandparents and was able to kind of get this story from them. Is this something that your organization is hoping to cultivate further, even to the point of people maybe who didn't know their great-grandparents, or are you trying to keep that direct line of connection with the speakers?
So we are absolutely, open to 4Gs. And I really think it's inevitable because as the 3Gs age and the next generation comes in, a lot of the 4Gs were able to meet their grandparents and hear those stories as well firsthand. And if they didn't, they're still connected through their parents who are the 3Gs. So I think it's exciting. And, obviously our last speaker, Erin, had a very close relationship with her great-grandmother, and it's really phenomenal that she was able to present that story and had, such a close connection and knew the story so well. So I think it's just inevitable that eventually the 4Gs will come into action. And, a lot of the 3Gs too, their kids are becoming a certain age where they're like, can they come to events? They're becoming interested in this history that is within their family. So it's really wonderful.
So you talked about a couple of events. What are some of the events that you've held in the past? And I know you talked about the Yom HaShoah event, maybe some things you're going to be planning in the future as well.
So a lot of our events are educational. We just had an event last week, actually, where we had a photographer author who came out with a book featuring he shot it during COVID, actually, and he interviewed over 100 survivors. It's a picture book, but there's stories about each of the photos that he took of these survivors. And he interviewed 2 survivors that are featured in the book. And we had a book talk essentially at Hebrew Union College downtown, which was a really exceptional event and really meaningful to hear the photographer and author and then these 2 survivors who were in the book and really more about their story and their background. So we'll have different events like that. Some of our main events that we have each year are every fall in October, we have an intergenerational brunch, which is really lovely. We have, again, mentioning 4Gs to survivors attend, which is really nice because a lot of 2Gs as well are now at an age where they're the senior generation. So it was their parents. So we have a lot of 2Gs who attend, and that's always a really well-received event. Every January, usually around International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we'll have a Shabbat dinner, and, during the year we'll have some just purely social happy hours, which are nice. And we also, during the pandemic, actually started a program that was virtual called We Do Wednesdays, where we have a volunteer speaker present what they would go into a school and present, which is really great because it gives access to the presentation, not just for school age. So, you're sharing it with older generations, again, 2Gs and like friends and people that wouldn't necessarily hear these, peers, colleagues, hear these presentations. So that has been really well received. And we were doing them like every other week for a period of time, but now it's tapered off to a few a year. But that's another main event that we have gotten a lot of really great feedback.
So what about people like myself who are not descendants? Is there, a place within your organization for them, attending events, things like that?
Absolutely. So I think our community events provide a really supportive forum for, the grandchildren of survivors, but also for anyone that is interested or wanting to be involved. I think one of the words that we describe a lot for the type of person that comes to our events are menschy individuals. And I think that really passes through. So, you don't have to be a grandchild of survivors to come to like the book talk that we had last week. In fact, there were a lot of people that were there that didn't have any familial connections to the Holocaust, but rather wanted to hear this author and wanted to hear these survivors. Same goes for our intergenerational brunch. People can come and they don't necessarily have to have that community, but we a lot in the past have had survivors speak during that brunch. So that's another, way to just be a part of our community. And, same again for the Shabbat dinner or a lot of our events, you don't have to necessarily be part of our We Do program, which is the volunteer program to go into schools. You can really just, come to our events and whether they're in person or virtual, and our community, I think, speaks for itself.
What made you decide to become president? Were you on the board before, or what kind of sparked that in you?
Yes. So I've always been very involved ever since I was young. And I was involved in 3GNY for a while and then became a board member in 2021. And really it evolved in that our president had been in the position for a while, like 6 years, and he was looking to stay on the board but step down. And he actually just asked me. And I did think about it for a while. And I had to be voted on as the president by the board. So It wasn't just like, yeah, sure, I'll do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think it was more just wanting to make sure I would be able to handle the time commitment with work and, but I had already been a board member prior. So it was kind of just like a natural progression in a way.
How long have you been president?
Since last, January.
Okay. Has it been interesting kind of coming out of COVID and working with programming and all of that?
Yes, very. Let's see, last year, maybe 2022 was probably the first year that we were fully doing things, but I think we didn't see the results of people attending events maybe until last year even. So it was very interesting, but it's good. I think the one thing that we see is for our social events, like happy hours, people really want to be social and want to be out there with the community. I think for so long we were inhibited with not being able to be in a crowded bar with people and that are like-minded and, share like a commonality. So it's really nice. And I think we've found that, we've had a lot of success in our in-person events.
So I want to talk about your family story. So, if someone doesn't have the opportunity to see you speak, I want them to be able to hear that. So on the website, it says that your grandparents are Holocaust refugees. Can you explain what the difference between that and a Holocaust survivor is?
Sure. So I believe the definition has actually changed, but growing up, we never called my grandparents Holocaust survivors. They were always refugees because they were able to escape and get out. And they were neither my maternal grandmother nor my maternal grandfather were in concentration camps. So because of that, we were always told, and they referred to themselves as refugees. It was never a survivor. I believe that the definition has changed now to anyone that was a victim of Nazi persecution, which started in 1933. So technically, under this newer definition, they would be considered survivors. But again, because they escaped, they were able to get out before going to a camp, we called them refugees.
Gotcha. That's what I thought. I just wanted to confirm what I thought without saying something. It's interesting. You're right. It has changed because I know there's that movie that just came out with Anthony Hopkins about the man whose name I can't remember.
I want to see that.
I do too, but it's only showing at the AMC in like the morning. So I'm trying to coordinate with a friend because she has an AMC pass and she is like a real job 9 to 5. And I was like, well, this is just not convenient at all for anyone. But he saved a bunch of children through the kinder transport and they've been referring to those children as survivors. So I do feel you are very correct that the terms really have changed because those children obviously left before they, their families would have died in the camps, but they themselves would not have been in camps.
Interesting. That is, yes. I think a lot of definitions have changed, or the way that I was taught anyways. Yeah.
How old were you when you learned about your grandparents' story?
So I always knew my grandparents were German and they spoke in German frequently around my sister and I, but I would say pretty specifically, I was in 6th grade and there was a writing contest, I think in Hebrew school, and about maybe it was like our family history. And I probably came home with a slip of paper and my mom was like, oh, you could, enter the contest. And at that point, though, what was interesting is I really had no concept of the magnitude of the story or really the history. I hadn't really learned anything at that point. I mean, we had read Number the Stars in 5th grade. That was about it.
Yes, which I was just saying is a perfect introduction to the Holocaust story. And I am obsessed with the cover art on that book as well. Side note, it's so beautiful.
It is. And it has like the aging of it, it's still on point now, however many years later after it was written. It's still so applicable and relevant. So I do remember reading that in public school and Hebrew school simultaneously, like literally the same unit, same time. But again, still didn't really understand the magnitude of everything and obviously my family history. So my mom at the time called my grandfather to get the facts of his story. And then I just like hand wrote it. And I mean, I definitely did not win the contest or whatever was happening with that. But that was really the first time that I learned what his story was and where he was from and all of that. And then when he passed away 2 years later, I was 14 and he was a war veteran. That's part of his story, but I actually read the story at like a local meeting for the Jewish war veterans in my town. So that was kind of more my awareness of it was, I would say like I was probably around 11 or 12 when I first learned.
So I'd love to hear the story about each of your grandparents individually, because I'm assuming that they weren't married when, maybe they were, I'm assuming.
That's correct. No.
I was just trying to think of like timing, what their life was like before the war. You mentioned your grandfather was a veteran, maybe during the war and then after the war, and maybe how they met as well.
Yes, sure. So they were both German Jews, which I think, definitely connected as to how they met after the war. But so I'll start with my grandmother, Trudy, and I was extremely close with both of my grandparents growing up. So my grandmother, Trudy, was born in Würzburg, Germany, and she was from the family was very integrated with society, and her father, she had a twin sister. Her father was, I believe, worked in insurance, and they were well off. They had a very, very nice upbringing. They were, integrated with non-Jews. She was Orthodox, went to a Jewish school, and, really had a very good life. Like, that's the one thing I remember. She would always talk to me up until the end of her life about Germany and her, before the war and before like Hitler came to power and how good things were. But she came from a pretty prominent family. A lot of her relatives were judges and lawyers. And she, during the 1930s, then after Hitler came to power, things just progressively started to get worse for the Jews, and slowly their, rights and privileges were taken away from them, to the point where they were trying to get out, but they were there during Kristallnacht, which is the 9th of November, the night of broken glass. And when I did interview her when I was in high school. And she describes it as being, young men came to the door, took her father away. He was sent to a concentration camp for multiple weeks, jailed, then a concentration camp. And she was locked in a room with her twin sister and her mother, and they just were breaking everything in the apartment, smashing glass. And, when they came out, everything was destroyed, and they knew that they had to get out. And fortunately, they had relatives who came to the United States. So they, had to give up everything. And again, they were fairly well off and prominent. So to give up literally everything you have and then, come to America, which took a very long time, they a very long journey to get here. But they, started from literally with nothing, like the bottom, and having family members that were lawyers and judges and all of these prominent positions. And my great-grandfather then, had to become a gardener, and my grandmother was around 16 when she came here. She was a babysitter and a nanny and, just taking whatever jobs that they could because they just needed to support themselves. But one of my grandmother's relatives actually was a very well-known attorney in Munich, and he's actually featured in a lot of the history books because this was like pretty early on in 1933 when Hitler came to power. He had reported, I believe, like through his work as a lawyer, that he wanted to file a complaint. So he went to a police station, like on behalf of a client. He was filing a complaint, and they actually made him parade through the streets with a sign around his neck. And his name was Michael Siegel. And so that was my grandmother's direct relative. So they, she had a lot of family that they kind of scattered all throughout the globe when they were trying to get to wherever they could. But yeah, so she had a lot of stories, just in terms of family members, and people went to China and Shanghai and South America, and really just wherever they could, they tried to get someone to get them out.
I think a lot of people don't realize that, like, at the very, very beginning, before the Holocaust, they just wanted the Jews out. So they were giving people an option to leave, but they had to leave their businesses and their money. They couldn't take anything with them. So, and I feel like this is something that I read in a lot of books about survivors, and thankfully this wasn't the case with your family, but there are a lot of people, especially wanted to immigrate to what was then called Palestine or to America, and they wanted to bring their parents, but their parents were like, I'm too old. I am settled here. I can't start over. So they ended up staying, and then most of the people ended up dying in concentration camps or, in other horrible ways. But, I think that, growing up, I was always like, well, why didn't they know what was going to happen? Why didn't they leave? And it's like, because, and I learned later it was because even if you were able to leave, it was completely starting over. Your great-grandparents were probably middle-aged at this point. That would have been very difficult.
Exactly. And also, my grandmother said that it was very expensive. Like, even though they had to give everything up, they had to pay all of this money to the German government. And then they had to have these sponsors in America, wherever you were going, to also pay for them. Yeah. So to have, I know she had family members that were able to help with them with visas, but I think you also had to have someone vouch for you, essentially, in the United States. So those people also had to put up a tremendous amount of money. So to have, just like strangers putting up all of this money for you, it was difficult. It was way more, when people are like, well, why didn't they just leave? It was very
involved. Yeah,
exactly.
It was very, very involved. And then at one point they stopped letting people leave, and then
exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So that was my grandmother's story, and it's actually my grandfather's story that I'll share in schools because his story is a bit more involved. So he was raised he was born in a smaller town called Osthofen, Germany, which is I've actually been to where he's from. So he's about, I guess, like an hour and a half or 2 hours or so south of Frankfurt. Okay. But it's a beautiful countryside, whereas my grandmother was more of the city, cosmopolitan upbringing, and there were vineyards and farms, and his father was a cattle farmer or rancher, and he died of natural causes. But my grandfather had 3 brothers and 1 sister. So it was quite a big family, but they were also very integrated, had a lot of, in society, had a lot of friends and community that appreciated them and respected them that were non-Jews. And I guess after my grandfather's father, so my great-grandfather passed away, they moved to a slightly bigger city nearby called Worms, which actually has a very famous synagogue, the Rashi Synagogue. Yeah, so that was like his synagogue, growing up, or when he was a bit older. And again, very integrated in the community. And he was a bit older, so he was born in 1917. So when Hitler came to power, he was already like older, trying to figure out work, job, what is he going to do? So he was going to, as an apprentice for hardware, and he was working for someone like a local shopkeeper as an apprentice in hardware. And he was also there on Kristallnacht, and we, learned that he had to go hide in a back room, and the store was obviously destroyed. And then he was also, along with his two brothers who were around his age, arrested on Kristallnacht. And his sister was a bit older, married, settled, and worked actually for the local city government. So she was able to secure my grandfather and two of his brothers' release at that time, with the promise that they would kind of just leave as soon as they could, if they could. And again, through his sister's husband, so my grandfather's brother-in-law's family, they were able to send, they had 3 visas essentially, but there were 5 people at that point remaining, figuring his sister was kind of taken care of because she was married. So it was my grandfather, and then he had a much younger brother who was, I think, like around 12 years old or so at that point. And so my great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother, had to decide, okay, I'll let my 3 older sons take these visas, and with the hope that maybe they could get to safety and send back for them. So after Kristallnacht, it was then they were really trying to essentially scramble and figure out next steps. So my grandfather and 2 of his 2 brothers, they went to Sweden for 2 years, actually, almost 2 years. They worked on a farm and in exchange for room and board. And during that time, my great-grandmother and my grandfather's youngest brother were taken to a ghetto and then ultimately taken to an extermination camp and killed there. They obviously didn't know what was happening at the time. My grandfather slowly made his way to the United States, where his sister was then at that point. He took the Trans-Siberian Railroad across Russia, then went to Japan, then Korea, then Japan, and then took a boat to the west coast of the United States, and then a bus to New York, where he first settled. And then eventually he went to Connecticut, which was where his sister was living. He got a job in a factory, and someone overheard him speaking with a German accent. And at this point, the United States was at war against the Germans in World War II, and they reported my grandfather as a spy. So he had to go to Washington, D.C. and meet with government officials. And then in order to test whether he was really a spy or not, their question was, would you fight for the United States? Figuring if he said no, then maybe he's a spy. So he said, yes, of course, I'm a refugee, and explained his story. And he went back home. Eventually, I think a few weeks later, I don't think it was that long, he received a draft letter in the mail, and he was drafted into the United States Army, fighting then for the United States, sent back to Europe, ultimately Germany. And he ended up landing as part of the troops on at D-Day on the beaches of Normandy, and was in
this is an insane story. I want to make a movie about your grandfather.
Yeah, he was, a really remarkable man, and so humble and modest, to think of everything that they had been through. But yes, so traveling all through these major battles in Europe during World War II, and eventually coming back to the United States, and he met my grandmother. I think a friend actually tried to set up one of my grandfather's brothers with my grandmother, but my grandfather ended up being available and offering to meet my grandmother at the bus when she was coming down. She had settled in Boston initially. So the bus from Boston came to New York, and my grandfather met the bus to help Trudy off the bus. And the rest is history.
That's insane. That is an insane story. That is crazy. Do you know which camp your great-grandmother and I guess he'd be your great-uncle were taken to?
Yes. So, yes, they were taken to Belzec, which was just an extermination camp. So they were murdered pretty quickly very quickly, I think, after arriving there.
So those are crazy stories. So one of my favorite things to talk about. One of the things I'm interested in is generational trauma in general. I think as Jewish people, we carry that. I feel like, I bring this up, I think, a few times on different shows where my mom used to not say Hanukkah in public and I would make fun of her. And now I get it because of everything that's going on right now. So even, my mother's great-grandmother came through Ellis Island in 1920. So, they didn't experience, Hitler coming to power in Europe and World War II, but still carry that trauma. I definitely am interested in the generational trauma that the descendants of Holocaust survivors carry. Is this something that your family dealt with, that maybe other 3GNYers dealt with?
Yeah, so I would say my grandparents were extremely positive people. I mean, really remarkable in terms of their outlook on life. And I am fortunate that whatever trauma that they held in with them because of their experiences, they really tried very hard not to pass that on to, if they could, to my mother, and my mother then to my generation. So I think it's almost the opposite. Like, they really tried to be so mindful of leading good lives that whatever trauma that they held, it wasn't outward facing. But I do think one thing I am very aware of, which I don't know if this is related. I think it could be. And since October 7th, I've actually thought more about this. I am, as you just mentioned, very aware of anti-Semitism. And I don't know if it's because I grew up in a pretty mixed area or what, but even when you travel, like I was always taught, don't wear a Star of David, like keep it low key. You don't have to, talk about, this, and like just kind of meld in. And I think that comes from my grandparents being immigrants, and, it was very different then than it is today. It was like meld in, become American, learn to speak English, So in terms of, not that that's trauma, but I think it's more just of like how you kind of live your life. So, when October 7th happened, a lot of friends of mine were, like aghast at the anti-Semitism that was coming out. And I wasn't that surprised. I mean, I don't know if it's just, I think it's because I've seen it's always there. It's just been underneath the surface, and it's sad, but I think I'm just very aware of that. So I would say that's something that that's been embedded in me, in terms of like, and again, it could be because of my family history, but my mom always reminds me that my grandfather always said, you don't look back, you just keep going forward. So I think in terms of trying to rebuild and move on with their lives, that's really the outlook that they took.
I think, like I said, I'm not a descendant of Holocaust survivors, but my great-grandmother lived in Russia during World War I and obviously would have lived through the pogroms, and they didn't talk about it. Like, to the point that we found, when my great aunt moved out of her house, we found a telegram that they sent from Ellis Island saying they were detained and needed money. God. So it's in my bedroom, it's framed. It says, detained Ellis Island, send money.
Wow.
So we didn't even know that. So it was so much so that they were like, we're going to move on. They didn't mention like a huge thing, being detained when you enter the country. Wow. So I think a lot of people who survived some sort of traumatic experience, especially when they were young adults, because I think my great-grandmother was 16 when they came. Or
yes.
She said she was 16. She lied about her age her whole life, so we don't know for sure.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, she's one of those ones who picked a birthday at Ellis Island because she didn't know what her birthday was in the English calendar. But I think it's something that a lot of people, even immigrants today, will kind of just forget and try to move on. And like you said, Americanize. And I feel like I'm the opposite of you, though. I feel like I was a little naive about the amount of anti-Semitism. I tell a story sometimes that, between acting gigs in my early 20s. I was working at a White House Black Market clothing store at a mall.
Nice.
It was very fancy.
Yeah.
And one of the people who worked there was a woman who's retired and was just kind of trying to make a little money and pass some time. And she was very active with the ADL. And I asked her, oh, what is that? And she explained it to me. And I said, I remember thinking, well, why do we need something like that now? Like this is not a problem in the same way. And throughout the course of time, I've realized that, organizations like that are very important. And I think I grew up a little sheltered. Like I come from an area of Los Angeles that has a very prominent Jewish community. I feel like I've said, I don't think I met anyone who wasn't Jewish maybe until I was like 5. Just being Jewish was normal. It was not something that was like othered. And I've talked to people who are even from other parts of Southern California, like one of our rabbis is from a non-Jewish area. And I've had conversations with her about the anti-Semitism that she dealt with in high school. And that's not something I dealt with. So I feel like a part of me is trying to atone for my ignorance a little bit by educating people.
No, of course. I mean, look, I think a lot of it is so dependent upon where you grew up and who you came into contact with, even regardless of your family history, because I think even a lot of 3Gs or descendants of survivors, they grew up in very Jewish areas and maybe, didn't experience that either. So I think it really is dependent, on a lot of different factors. But yeah, I don't think it just, because of who my grandparents were makes that any different. I think it's just like that combined with different things and what they spoke about additionally.
So you mentioned that you've been to Germany to see where your grandfather is from. Have you seen where your grandmother's from? What was that experience like? Were there any, remnants of relatives there?
So I went to Germany. I've been twice. The first time, and I can give a small shout out. It's a program called Germany Close Up, where American Jews are subsidized through the German government to go to Germany. It's an amazing trip.
Is there an age cap on this program that I am interested in now?
I actually don't think there is. No.
That's amazing. What is this called?
It's called Germany Close Up.
Okay, great.
And there's different organizations that it will be affiliated with. So I went with, I think it was like the Federation of Pittsburgh on my trip. So like different organizations will kind of connect. So I went on that trip in 2015, and originally I had heard about it, but the itinerary also went to my grandfather's hometown. So I was like, oh, this is perfect. So you spend a long amount of time in Berlin, like about a week, and then go to Frankfurt and then Heidelberg and Worms, which is where my grandfather was from. So during that trip, we went to the Rashi Synagogue, and after the Holocaust, the survivors of Worms put together a big, basically like commemoration and memorial for the individuals that were lost in their community. So I was able to see that my grandfather had kind of taken a part in helping form. And, my great grandmother and my great uncle were on this wall in the synagogue. So that was really meaningful. But in terms of, because it was a group trip, it wasn't, I saw the area and I saw the town, but it wasn't that detailed, in terms of like, oh, this is where my grandfather lived and this is where their house was and that kind of thing. So it was really a fabulous experience though. And I found, the German people that I encountered to be really warm and welcoming, and especially the younger generations that were, as I'm a child of a survivor, grandchildren of potentially Nazis. So it was a really powerful, interesting, eye-opening trip. And then in 2018, this is a very interesting story. So my mom received a Facebook message from someone who lived in California and asked, are you Rudy Herz's daughter? And it turns out that this individual, his name is Sandy Jacoby, he lives out in California. He was going through his father's belongings and found a photo that had my grandfather in it and his father, and they were both in army uniforms. So after the war. So my mom replies back, yes, I am. And Sandy tells her that there's a book being written about the Jews of the Rhineland, which is the area in Germany. and that this photo was going to be featured in this book. And would we want to come to, I mean, they went back and forth a bit more, but, would we be interested in coming for this weekend to Germany for a few days for this like book reception? So we said, sure. So that was actually the second time I went, and it was a very quick trip, but we kind of explored the surrounding towns near my grandfather's, and we went to the cemetery where his father, so my great grandfather, was buried. The headstone was still there, which was unbelievable.
That's amazing considering the history of everything that happened to Jewish cemeteries.
Yes. No, exactly. So it was still there. And then through another organization, on one of the days that we had free, this is a really remarkable organization. This group of all non-Jews in Worms and the surrounding areas, call themselves, I think it's the 9th of November committee, and they've taken upon themselves to research the Jewish history in the town and note all of the homes that used to be Jews, and really just like the history of all of the families there. They have commemorative ceremonies on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, and also throughout Germany, throughout Europe, there are what's called Stolpersteins, which are like they're translated to stumbling blocks.
The gold, which are not in Munich, by the way. They don't have them in Munich, and that's a whole thing.
I did not know that. I've never been to Munich.
Yes.
So, okay, that's very interesting. Wow. I mean, they have them in other cities throughout Europe too, but I mean, it started in Germany, from my understanding. But so, this committee also helps put these stones in for where they learned that the families had lived. So for my great uncle and great grandmother, they had stepping stones that were placed, and they were there for the ceremony because there was no direct descendants that could be there. So it's an amazing organization. One of the individuals that's involved, her name is Inga May. So on one of the days that I was on this trip and I went with my mother and sister, she took us around the whole town for the whole day, showing us, well, now it's a bank, but this is where your grandfather used to live, and this is the town, and it's a walking tour. And we met with other individuals of the organization who came out and had lunch with us. And even though they couldn't even speak English and we couldn't speak German, it was a really amazing experience to have these people who might not have any connection or might have had a connection, who knows, but just out of the goodness of their hearts are involved in this organization to kind of restore and remember the Jewish communities in this town.
It's really interesting to me, kind of speaking of this generational trauma, when we were in Germany, we had tour guides who were about our age, and them, thinking about their grandparents. My mom's father fought in Germany in World War II and didn't talk about what he saw.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know too many things.
Wow.
It was apparent. I mean, I don't know. It must have been pretty traumatic.
Sure.
But thinking about their grandparents fighting in the war and how they feel about that, and then the guilt that you feel, but also I remember reading an article once about a woman who was very close with her grandmother. I think she was American, but her grandmother was a Nazi. She was a member of the Nazi party, and trying to kind of in her head work out this woman that she knew and grew up with who loved her and was caring and giving, but was also a Nazi. So, it's kind of, it's so, again, the idea of this generational trauma and the psychological effects of everything that happened in World War II is super interesting to me. And
yes.
I wish there was more research about this.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
Again, yet another book I get to write. Exactly. I've got all these ideas. I've got all these ideas and not enough free time. But maybe that this organization is kind of an offshoot of that, of people trying to, in their mind, right the wrongs of maybe something that their parents or grandparents might have done. I think that's really lovely that they took you on that tour and you were able to see all of that. And that it was still there, because I know in certain parts of Europe, stuff's not there anymore.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it was really great. So, really just a wonderful, warm reception from all of the non-Jewish Germans that we met along the way. It was honestly very remarkable. And we still talk about the trip, frequently, about how wonderful of an experience it was.
Yeah, I think with the exception of like one person, everybody we met in that one tour guide at Dachau, this guy was crazy. He like, I don't know if you're going to use this, but we took this tour of Dachau, just so you know, we took this tour of Dachau, and this guide, we were there for hours, and they really only focused on the fact that it was a camp for political prisoners. And then like jumped to the end of the war. And about an hour into the tour, Patrick turned to me and he goes, do you notice he hasn't said the word Holocaust or Jew once?
Wow.
And then I was like, yeah. And then like, it was just like kind of offensive. And I actually ended up writing a letter to the owner of the company who came up with some like, well, this is the history. And then it's like, yeah, this is part of the history. And yes, it was the first concentration camp, but it was for political prisoners, but also like a bunch of Jews were murdered there as well.
Yeah,
and that's also
lot.
important to talk about.
Yes.
But like here, you can tell your part of the story because I did, this was, yes.
No, so we were in a rather, I know you can't see me, sorry. We were in a rather large group, and the tour was kind of a mess to begin with. We were supposed to take a bus out there.
A train.
No. We were supposed to take a bus out there, but something happened with the bus. So they ended up buying us all train tickets. Now, the irony of a lot of this is not lost on me. So we end up all getting shoved onto this commuter train, which didn't have enough seats, and everybody's standing in the aisles.
Wow.
all crammed together, trying to go out to Dachau. Then they get us off of the train to shove into a public transportation bus, which again, we are like a New York subway car, all kind of crammed together on this, bus to then drive to the gates of Dachau. Then the group that we're with, a lot of Americans and a lot of Americans who are, from the South and clearly not Jewish and clearly maybe don't know what the history of this location actually is and what actually happened at this location. So as we were going through and the guide's giving the tour, a woman kept asking him, because he was saying, he was basically describing, well, this camp was only men and they would bring people in, and if you were a child, you were taken away. And that's really all that he would say about it. And she kept asking, well, what did they do with the kids after? Well, they took them away. Where did they go? He's like, well, if you were under 14, then you really were taken away. You weren't, this was a working camp, so people would work here and, they didn't need kids, so they would take them away. And she just kept asking over and over and over again. It was probably the fifth or sixth time she asked. I finally just turned to her and went, they killed them. They just murdered the children. They shot them. They took them in the back and shot them. That's what they did with the kids. And she was just kind of like, oh, but the guide was just too afraid or didn't want to reveal that part of the history. He just kind of was, it felt like he was almost covering it up or almost trying to make allusion to it without being blunt, by saying, oh, well, they would take them away or they would never be seen again or they would da-da-da, but not in so many words that would be so forward that people would, people who don't know the history would understand. Yeah. So,
wow. Yeah. I mean, you can't rewrite the history.
Yeah,
That's
it's
the
history.
Like it's
So we because of that had this whole conversation about like maybe this guy's grandparents were Nazis. Who knows? Like if he lives there, like the whole thing. But it was, and then he went on a tangent about how like at the end of the war they were using children as guards, and then the Americans killed them when they came. And I'm like, am I supposed to feel bad about this? It's like a weird, interesting thing. But other than that guy, everyone else in Germany that we came across was really lovely. And then when we got to Poland, it was very interesting to see about how they talked about the Germans and all of that. And this was around the time that they outlawed saying Polish death camps. I think that had just happened when we went. So there was a lot of feelings involving this.
Yeah. I'm sure. I've never been to Poland. But
Poland, first of all, like all the Holocaust history aside, is beautiful and it's very cheap. And I recommend going to Poland all the time to people. Yes. And especially, maybe not right now. I don't know. But Krakow is beautiful. It's the only medieval town square that wasn't destroyed during World War II. I don't know. I think it's the only one. So there's this medieval marketplace with the old stalls, and it's really beautiful. And it's, I recommend Poland to everybody, not just because I want to end up taking tour groups there. and to the camps. But I
Right.
loved Poland. It was great.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yes. So kind of going back on subject, if someone is interested in starting to learn about the Holocaust, what material would you direct them to? Maybe interviews or books or maybe even, coming to one of your lectures, I think might be a good place as well.
Yeah. So I would say, depending upon where you live, I would encourage you to go to a museum to start.
We have a really nice one downtown.
Yes, amazing. And I think it's an excellent, they do an excellent job of sharing the Holocaust and the history and what happened. And I was just there last year, but hadn't been in like decades. And, the exhibits are new and it's really,
One
it's
of the
very
things
well done.
I like that they do is they talk about European Jewry before the war. And I feel like a lot of museums don't do that. Not only because I think is it more emotionally effective to talk about, well, this is what it was and this is what happened, but I think it humanizes a little bit.
Yes,
and they have some really cool artifacts. And then they also do the Jews after the war, which I think is also really cool. And they have a good gift shop.
Yes.
And I love a gift shop.
Yes. And it's a really beautiful space, in terms of the museum and the location and all of that. So I would say if you're in New York, definitely take a trip to the Museum of Jewish Heritage in Battery Park. And if you're not, a lot of these museum websites have significant and comprehensive history as well. Like the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. is a phenomenal resource, and they have a lot as well. But I think, I think books are also a great place to start, and it can be historical fiction even because, a lot of novels are based on true stories, and you can learn a lot from that as well. So I think, that's another really good place to start. And there's some recent TV series even that have been made from books or just TV series that I think are also really good places to start. Like there was the show or the limited series last year about Miep Gies and a little light who she hid the Frank family in Amsterdam. I mean, I thought that was a really great, obviously tragic, but very good depiction of like both sides and just the whole experience almost. And I know there was another book that it was just made into a series.
Yeah, they have a couple coming out. The Tattooist of Auschwitz is coming out.
Okay.
But there's been some controversy about that book, and you can Google that if you're curious, friends.
I haven't read that.
Yeah,
okay.
It's very like, I guess people... and I want to say this to anybody listening. Holocaust testimony is very personalized and everybody's experience was different. So it's really hard for people, in my opinion, it's really hard for me when people are like, well, this was not what happened. But if this is a true story or based on a true story, this is what happened to this person. It'd be like me saying, well, what happened to your grandfather isn't what happened to refugees. So I feel like that was the kind of the controversy involving the Tattooist of Auschwitz, because I guess this specific prisoner lived in like better conditions and there were some weird things. There's also one that just came out this week called We Were the Lucky Ones, which is about a family of survivors. So there's a lot of, and then there's that movie about, with Anthony Hopkins, that guy. So there's a lot of stuff coming out, which is good. I feel like there's the Holocaust makes great media. So I feel like there's never a lack of that coming out.
It's true. It's true. And I did read that book, We Were the Lucky Ones. So it was an excellent book. So I'm sure, the series will probably be good. But I think all of that people can learn from and, take something away from. So it depends if you really want to go into how deep you want to dig in terms of the facts. But, obviously I didn't see Schindler's List until I was an adult, but, much more recently even. But I think that is, if you really want to learn what happened, I think that is a very powerful depiction.
Which my sister has not seen still, if you're listening. I keep saying every time she's here or I'm home, we should watch it. And she's like, I need to be in a very specific mood. And I'm like, I don't know if you're ever in a mood to watch Schindler's List. Like, no, I don't think you wake up one day and you're like, you know what I'm going to do today? This, you know what I mean?
No, exactly. And actually I saw it. It was an anniversary showing at the Beacon Theater in New York where they had the cast, including Steven Spielberg, come and speak. And I figured, you know what? I haven't seen it. So this is a good opportunity because you're not watching it at home, like on the couch. It's you're watching it in a huge theater with, hundreds of people, thousands of people. So that was when I saw it.
That's a very good first watching of Schindler's story. Mine was not that exciting. I think I was like by myself at my parents' house, and I was like, well, I think I'm interested in watching this right now. And then I was horrified by myself, which, I think when it comes to certain things like that, like maybe you don't want a communal experience. It's like, it's different.
Yes, that's true. That's a really good point. And it just depends on what you're looking for and what you're trying to learn.
Yeah. So let's talk about you for a second. You have a very interesting job, I think. How did you what made you decide to become a lawyer, and how did you end up at your current position? You would obviously share what you do.
Sure. So yes, I'm a lawyer, and I work as an assistant district attorney at the Bronx District Attorney's Office in the Homicide Bureau. So I think a lot of my strengths played into going into law school, like being good at speaking and reading and writing, and really, a lot of strengths help, going into law school and becoming a lawyer. But I think at the time, I felt, I was encouraged, I should say, as that is a good path for me and for what my background and interests were. And I was always a good student. So when I got to law school, though, I really had no idea what type of lawyer I wanted to be. And I think I did, the idea of helping people with the law was always there. And obviously it's nice to, go into corporate law and, you're always like helping someone in some capacity. But I think in the back of my mind, in the very beginning of law school, they had us write on note cards, like, what do you want to do when you graduate? And like, what do you think you want to do in terms of like how you want to use the law? And I actually wrote on the card, like, help people in some way. So I think that was always
rare for a lawyer. I feel like a lot of people would be like, make a lot of money.
Exactly. So, I mean, obviously that is important and nice, and, you need to live. But then I still wasn't really sure. And I realized, litigation would probably be a good fit because, again, I really liked public speaking and I didn't, get nervous when I was up speaking in front of people. But then a lot of my classes I found to be very challenging, oddly, except for criminal law. And for whatever reason, those were the classes, it just clicked. And I realized, I could be an assistant district attorney and like really help people in terms of giving them a voice, bringing justice. And it just kind of aligned with like a lot of the values I had. In addition, I had an internship at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. And I was like, this is exactly what I want to do. Like, I don't see anything else that I really see myself doing, which is very specific. And so then I really just pursued getting a job at a district attorney's office when I graduated.
That's crazy. I couldn't deal with your job. I feel like I'm sure, like I was saying, I think you've probably seen some insane things and dealt with all that. Is it really like super high pressure?
Yes, no, it is. I mean, it also is it's intense. There's really not, as you saw before, I'm always getting calls and messages and you're kind of never really off, but also you're always thinking about things like, what have I forgotten? What do I need to do? What's the next step? So, I think a lot of law and being an attorney is high pressure, but I think it's also like people's lives, people are in jail. There are victims of crimes. Now I'm dealing with homicide. So sadly, the victims have no voice to speak for themselves. But before I'd have victims of attempted murders and shootings and slashings. And you're like, well, these are such tragic situations. And a lot of them are also immigrants. And I think, coming from like the background with my grandparents, I obviously can't relate. I was born in America, but I feel for their experiences and they don't know how to navigate the system. And it's so hard and overwhelming. And maybe they're injured and they can't work anymore. And that's, I don't deal with a lot of like helping them with resources, but I feel like I talk to them enough. I could, I have like such empathy and sympathy for what they're going through because a lot of the time they don't take it upon themselves. It's like wrong place, wrong time. So yes, it can definitely be stressful, but look, every job has some measure of stress.
Some more than others. So this last portion of my show, we like to call this my version of the Actor's Studio, if you ever watch that. These are just kind of short form questions, and they're a little fun because sometimes we have serious discussions like we did. So I like to end on a lighter note. So what is your favorite Yiddish word?
I feel like I say oy vey the most. I mean, it's just so all-encompassing. What other word in the English language can encapsulate oy vey? But I also think there's some other words that are really powerful, all-encompassing that we just don't have similar words for, like chutzpah. That's a great one. Love that. Mensch, again, like just a really good, noble person. Tying it back to 3GNY, we always say like we're such a menschy organization in terms of the type of person that's involved. And I think those are some of my favorite ones.
What is your favorite Jewish holiday?
Rosh Hashanah. And I would say because it's the start of the new year, it's a fresh start.
So I know we talked about not being into themed bat mitzvahs, but if you were to have, let's say someone gives you a big budget to throw a big blowout for your re-bat mitzvah, what would your theme be?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I would say let's go with ice cream flavors.
That's not one I've gotten. I mean, I love ice cream too. There is something. Well, I guess my sister doesn't like ice cream because milk makes her stomach upset. But most people, I think, like ice cream.
Yes.
What profession other than your own would you want to attempt?
I've always been interested in journalism. And I think I studied it a bit in college, and I think it's in some ways similar to what I do right now.
If heaven is real and God is there to welcome you, what would you like to hear them say?
Oh, wow. I would say, first of all, I would like to see the relatives that I've lost and be reunited with them. And I think that would be enough. But I also, so many people say, how could there be a God if so many bad things happen? Tying it back to our whole conversation, how could there be a God if the Holocaust happened and 6 million Jews were murdered? I think you have to say, God created man, there is good and there is evil, and things happen because evil overrides good. And I think sometimes we just don't know why bad things happen, but we just have to have faith that things will work out. And if I were to meet God, I would like him to affirm that.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This has been Sheep Are in the City, and I am Nicole Kelly.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. Since I interviewed Elizabeth, we have some updated statistics about 3GNY. She told me that for the 2023-2024 school year, they did 131 virtual presentations and 135 in-person presentations in school. They've reached 1,376 students at a mix of public and private schools and currently have 6,200 people on their mailing list or affiliated as members. If you're interested in becoming a member of 3GNY, be sure to check out their website and sign up for their events. Thank you to everyone who participated in the Instagram giveaway this past week. Please be sure to follow me on Instagram for future giveaways, as well as fun pictures and videos. I'm going to be doing a lot more videos now that I'm not a full-time student and I have a little more time. Please be sure to follow me on TikTok as well. And you can also DM me if you have any questions, suggestions, or want to be a guest yourself. Thank you so much for listening.